Port Phillip. Just the bay is a large bay in southern Victoria, Australia. It is the location of Melbourne. Geographically, the bay covers 1,930 square kilometres and the shore stretch is roughly 264 kilometres. Although it is extremely shallow for its size, most of the bay is navigable. The deepest portion is only 24 metres, and half the region is shallower than 8 metres. The volume of the water in the bay is around 25 cubic kilometres. Prior to British settlement, the area around Port Phillip was divided between the territories of the Wadawurrung, Wurundjeri and Boonwurrung nations. Its waters and coast are home to seals, whales, dolphins, corals, and many kinds of seabirds and migratory waders. The first British to enter the bay were the crews of HMS Lady Nelson, commanded by John Murray, and 10 weeks later, HMS Investigator, commanded by Matthew Flinders. In 1802, subsequent expeditions into the bay took place in 1803 to establish the first settlement in Victoria, near Sorrento, but was abandoned in 1804. 30 years later, settlers from Tasmania returned to establish Melbourne, now the state's capital city, at the mouth of the Yarra River in 1835 and Geelong at Corio Bay in 1838. Today, Port Phillip is the most densely populated catchment in Australia, with an estimated 4.5 million people living around the bay. Melbourne's suburbs extend around much of the northern and eastern shorelines, and the city of Geelong sprawls around Corio Bay in the bay's western arm. Prehistory. Port Phillip Bay formed between the end of the last ice age around 8000 BCE and around 6000 BCE, when the sea level rose to drown what was then the lower reaches of the Yarra River. Vast river plains, wetlands and lakes. The Yarra and other tributaries flowed down what is now the middle of the bay, formed a lake in the southern reaches of the bay, dammed by the heads, subsequently pouring out into Bay Strait. The Aboriginal people were in occupation of the area long before the bay was formed, having arrived at least 20,000 years ago and possibly 40,000 years ago. Large piles of semi-fossilized seashells known as middens can still be seen in places around the shoreline, marking the spots where Aboriginal people held feasts. They made a good living from the abundant sea life, which included penguins and seals. In the cold season they wore possum skin cloaks and elaborate feathered headdresses. A dry period combined with sandbar formation may have dried the bay out as recently as between 800 BCE and 1000 CE. British exploration. In 1800, Lieutenant James Grant RN was the first known explorer to pass through Bay Strait from west to east in HMS Lady Nelson. He was also the first to see and crudely chart the south coast from Cape Banks in South Australia to Wilson's Promontory in Victoria. Grant gave the name Governor Kings Bay to the body of water between Cape Otway and Wilson's Promontory, but did not venture in and discover Port Phillip. The first Britons to discover and enter Port Phillip were the crew of the Lady Nelson, commanded by John Murray, which entered the bay on the 15th of February 1802. Murray called the bay Port King after the Governor of New South Wales, Philip Gidley King. On the 4th of September 1805, King formally renamed it Port Phillip in honour of his predecessor Arthur Phillip. About 10 weeks after Murray, Matthew Flinders RN and HMS Investigator also found and entered the port as unaware Murray had been there. The official history of Nicholas Borden's explorations in Le Geographique claimed they too had sighted the entrance at the time, but this is almost certainly a later embellishment or error, being absent from the ship's logs and Borden's own accounts. As a result of Murray's and Flinders' reports, King sent Lieutenant Charles Robbins in HMS Cumberland to explore Port Phillip fully. One of his party, Charles Grimes, became the first European to walk right around the bay, and thus to discover the mouth of the Yarra. On the 2nd of February 1803, British settlement. King decided to place a convict settlement at Port Phillip, mainly to stake a claim to southern Australia ahead of the French. On the 10th of October 1803, a convoy of 2 ships, HMS Calcutta and Ocean, led by Captain David Collins, carrying 402 people, entered Port Phillip Bay. After some investigation, it was decided to establish the settlement at a spot known as Sullivan Bay, very close to where Sorrento now exists. The expedition landed at Sullivan Bay on the 17th of October 1803, and the first of the orders issued by Collins bears the date. On the 25th of October, the King's birthday, the British flag was hoisted over the tiny settlement, and a little salvo of musketry celebrated the royal occasion. On the 25th of November, the first white child was born in Victoria and was baptized on Christmas Day, receiving the name of William James Hobart Thorne. The first marriage took place on the 28th of November, when a free woman, Hannah Harvey, was wedded to convict Richard Garrett. Lack of fresh water and good timber, however, led this, the first attempt at British settlement in Victoria, to be abandoned on the 27th of January 1804. When Collins left Port Phillip, the Calcutta proceeded to Sydney, and the Ocean to Risdon Cove, Tasmania, where they arrived on the 15th of February 1804. Prior to abandonment, a group of convicts, including William Buckley, escaped from the settlement. Buckley later took up residence in a cave near Point Lonsdale on the western side of the bay's entrance, the Rip. Port Phillip was then left mostly undisturbed until 1835, when settlers from Tasmania, led by John Batman and John Pascoe Faulkner, established Melbourne on the lower reaches of the Yarra. John Batman encountered William Buckley, who then became an important translator in negotiations with the local indigenous tribesmen. In 1838, Geelong was founded, and became the main port serving the growing wool industry of the Western District. For a time, Geelong rivaled Melbourne as the leading settlement on the bay, but the gold rush, which began in 1851, gave Melbourne a decisive edge as the largest town in Victoria. Growth and development of Melbourne. As Melbourne prospered, its wealthy classes discovered the recreational uses of Port Phillip. Bayside suburbs such as St Kilda and Brighton were established on the east shore of the bay. Later, resorts further south such as Sorrento and Portsea became popular. The more swampy western shores of the bay were not so favoured, and have been used mainly for non-residential purposes such as the Point Cook Royal Australian Air Force Base and the Werribee Sewage Farm. In recent decades, the population along the western side of the bay has grown more rapidly. In the 21st century, property along the Port Phillip coastline continues to be highly sought after. Port Phillip continues to be extensively used for recreational pursuits such as swimming, cycling, boating, and fishing. The bay also features a number of historical walks and fauna reserves. The traditional landowners of the area have also been acknowledged at a number of sites. Geography. Port Phillip lies in southern Victoria, separated from Bass Strait by the Bellarine Peninsula to the southwest and Mornington Peninsula to the southeast. It is the largest bay in Victoria and one of the largest inland bays in Australia. The narrow entrance to the bay, called the Rip, between Point Lonsdale and Point Nepean, features strong tidal streams made turbulent by the uneven contours of the seabed. The best time for small craft to enter the Rip is at slack water. Large ships require expert local guidance to enter and exit, provided by the Port Phillip sea pilots. Work has commenced to deepen the channel entrance to allow newer, larger container ships to access Melbourne's docks. The eastern side of the bay is characterized by sandy beaches extending from St Kilda, Sandringham, Beaumaris, Carrum, and down the Mornington Peninsula to Frankston, Safety Beach, Dromana and right at Portsea. Longshore drift carries sand from south to north during winter and from north to south during summer. Cliff erosion control has often resulted in sand starvation, necessitating offshore dredging to replenish the beach. On the western side of the bay there is a greater variety of beach types, including both sandy and sandstone rock beaches, seen at Queen's Cliff, St Leonard's, Indented Head, Portarlington, Altona and Geelong's eastern beach. Numerous sandbanks and shoals occur in the southern section of the bay, and parts of the South Channel require occasional maintenance dredging. Climate: the region has an oceanic climate with warm summers possessing occasional very hot days due to northerly winds and mild winters. Annual rainfall, which is evenly distributed over the year, shows considerable variation due to the Otway Ranges to the southwest. The northwestern shore of the bay is the driest part of southern Victoria and almost approaches a semi-arid climate with a mean annual rainfall as low as 425 mm, whilst the eastern shores less shielded by the Otways receive as much as 850 mm. Summer temperatures average around 25 degrees Celsius during the day and 14 degrees Celsius at night, but occasional northerly winds can push temperatures over 40 degrees Celsius. Whilst in winter a typical day will range from 6 degrees Celsius to 14 degrees Celsius. Beaches: Port Phillip hosts many beaches, most of which are flat, shallow and long, with very small breaks making swimming quite safe. This attracts many tourists, mostly families, to the beaches of Port Phillip during the summer months and school holidays. Water sports such as bodyboarding and surfing are difficult or impossible, except in extreme weather conditions. However, stand-up paddleboarding, kite surfing and windsurfing are very popular. Most sandy beaches are located on the bay's northern, eastern and southern shorelines, while the western shorelines host a few sandy beaches. There mostly exists a greater variety of beaches, swampy wetlands and mangroves. The occasional pebble beach and rocky cliffs can also be found, mostly in the southern reaches. Major beaches include St Kilda Beach, Brighton Beach, Sandringham Beach, Dromana Beach. Rivers and creeks: Rivers: Jarrah River, Maribyrnong River, Paterson River, Little River, Werribee River. Creeks: Cananook Creek, Sweetwater Creek, Cowies Creek, Cororoit Creek, Chinamans Creek. Islands: due to its shallow depth, numerous artificial islands and forts have been built. However, despite the depth, it only hosts a few true islands. Many sandy, muddy banks and shallows exist in its southern reaches, such as mud islands, but most islands are located in the marshy shallows of Swan Bay. Some of the bay's major islands include Swan Island, Mud Islands, Duck Island, South Channel Fort, Popeseye, surrounding mountains and hills: Arthur's Seat 314 meters, Mount Martha 160 meters, Mount Eliza, Oliver's Hill, Flinders Peak 364 meters, surrounding lakes: Albert Park Lake, Cherry Lake, Lake Borre, Lake Karama, Lake Illawong and Lake Lagana of Paterson Lakes, Lake Connewarra, Lake Victoria, Raft Lake, Sanctuary Lakes, Salt Lagoon. Ecology: jellyfish are a familiar sight in Port Phillip, and its waters are home to species such as Australian fur seals, bottlenose dolphins, common dolphins, humpback whales, and southern right whales. Many other cetacean species may also migrate off the areas. The smooth-toed fish is one of the most common fishes in muddy areas. The bay has many endemic species, including the blue devilfish and fantastic sponge whales on the Lonsdale Wall in the heads of the bay. It also hosts breeding colonies of Australian fur seals, occasionally Australian sea lions, New Zealand fur seals, subantarctic fur seals, and leopard seals may come into the bay as well. Certain individual southern elephant seals may frequent the bay as well. Swan Bay, adjacent to Queen's Cliff, is an important feeding ground for water birds and migratory waders. The Mud Islands, off Sorrento, are an important breeding habitat for white-faced storm petrels, silver gulls, Australian pelicans and Pacific gulls. Salt marshes in the northwestern sections of the bay, such as that in the Werribee Sewage Farm and the adjacent Spit Nature Conservation Reserve, are within the Port Phillip Bay and Bellarine Peninsula Ramsar site, listed as wetlands of international importance under the Ramsar Convention, and the critically endangered orange-bellied parrot is found at 3 wintering sites with salt marsh habitat around Port Phillip and the Bellarine Peninsula. A variety of seabirds, such as Australasian gannets, nest on artificial structures in the bay. Port Phillip contains 3 marine sanctuaries managed by Parks Victoria to protect and conserve the bay's biodiversity, ecological processes and the natural and heritage features. Original flora and fauna. In 1906, George Gordon McRae wrote 2 letters to a local schoolmaster at Dromana, Mr. G.H. Rogers. His subject was his earliest recollections of an idyllic boyhood spent at Arthur's Seat Run, location of the historic McRae homestead on the southern shore of the bay, part of the Mornington Peninsula. In the letters he described in detail the natural history of the area in the 1840s, and the species he particularly remembered 60 years later. In 1939, Charles Daly read an article before the Victorian Historical Society based on these letters, which was published in the magazine in 1940, the year after a large bushfire in January 1939 hastened the disappearance of much of the original, surviving wildlife from the area. The names of the species reflect the titles given to them by the original British settlers of the bay. The animals he observed as a young boy were immense droves of kangaroos, brush kangaroos, a wallaby, paddy melon, bandicoots, great opossum, ringtail, flying squirrel, flying mouse, dingoes or wild dogs in the gullies that were caught in box traps with sliding doors, porcupine, anteater or echidna that were at the back of Arthur's Seat Mountain, the great iguana, tree lizard 5 feet, python, and the rocker sleeping lizard. The trees were coast banksia, honeysuckle, and grass trees, with crowns for thatching. The gum of Xanthorrhea australis was used for carriage varnish. In the waters of the bay he described scallop shells which were used as an oil lamp, with a bulrush wick, banks of cockles covered with birds, grey and white gulls, a 13 to 16 pounds size snapper ground off Mount Martha Point, mutton fisher, Venus earbait, coatfish, parrotfish, leather jackets, flathead, dogfish, stingrays, shark-tailed rays, and pigfish that he thought to be very old. On the beaches could be sighted pelicans, penguins, grey and grey-white gull, called bungan by Aborigines, small white and lavender gull, pied oyster catchers, terns, cormorants, the little sandpiper, and musk ducks. In the swamps were the nankeen bird with one long white feather behind the ear, the rail, the bittern, the snipe and jacksnipe, several ducks, wood duck, black duck, teal, spoonbill, black swan geese, cranes, blue and white coots, water hens, kingfishers here and there, and swamp, a ground parrot with the barred tail feathers. Quote, In the scrub by the waterholes were honey-eaters, warblers, red-coat robins, emu wren with two long feathers in tail, laughing jackass everywhere, utcherbird, also known as shrike, a whistling jackass, quail where coverage good in bottom of scrub, turkey at Borneo and the big swamp off the property. On the flats were found spur-wing plovers, minas, and leatherheads. In timbers near the flats were many varieties of parrots: lorry, rosella, blue mountain, a honeysuckle parrot, sulphur-crested white cockatoo, black cockatoo of two kinds, grey cockatoo with scarlet crest, and kerala, a cockatoo parrot. Among the cherry trees in the garden at the homestead were bronze-winged pigeon and satin birds, lovebirds, and honey-eating parakeets. Birds of prey were eagle, hawks, falcons, and owls, some white and of great size. Cetaceans. Small numbers of common dolphins have become residents in eastern parts of the bay since the late 2000s. In recent years, the numbers of southern humpback and southern right whales entering the Bay of Port Phillip have shown increases. Unlike in Portland and on Great Ocean Road, southern rights in eastern Victorian waters are still critically endangered and in very small numbers. However, presences of cow-calf pairs in the bay in recent years indicate that Port Phillip Bay was possibly once a wintering calving ground for these whales. They swim very close to shores to take rests in shallow, sheltered waters, sometimes just next to piers in Frankston. Baroon dolphins. The bay is home to about 100 to 150 of the recently described species of bottlenose dolphin, the Baroon dolphin. The other 50 or so of this rare species are to be found in the Gippsland Lakes. Environmental issues, like the Yarra which flows into it. Port Phillip faces the environmental concerns of pollution and water quality. Litter, silt and toxins can affect the beaches to the point where they are shut down by the EPA. In 2008, the owner and master of Hong Kong-registered container vessel MV Skylucky were found liable for illegally disposing garbage into Port Phillip, convicted and fined $35,000. Shipping history. The southern section of the bay near the heads is covered by extensive sand banks, known as the Great Sand. A shipping channel was dredged in an east-west direction from the heads to near Arthur's Seat late in the 19th century, and maintained ever since. Early shipping used piers at Sandridge, but later moved to various wharves along the Yarra River, which make up today's Port of Melbourne. The Melbourne Harbour Trust and Geelong Harbour Trust were responsible for the piers and wharves in the respective cities. They are now the government-owned Port of Melbourne Corporation and the privately operated Geelong Port. Today, the Port of Melbourne has grown to become Australia's busiest commercial port, serving Australia's second-largest city and handling an enormous amount of imports and exports into and out of the country. The Port of Geelong also handles a large volume of dry bulk and oil, while nearby Port of Hastings on Western Port handles steel and oil products. In 2004, the Victorian government launched the Port Phillip Channel Deepening Project to deepen the existing shipping channels and the Lower Yarra to accommodate deeper draft vessels. The Lower Yarra sediments were identified as likely to be contaminated with toxic chemicals and heavy metals, and were to be contained within a sealed berm clear of the shipping channels south of the Yarra entrance. The vessel chosen for the dredging is the Queen of the Netherlands. 52 environmental groups, recreational fishing groups, and divers groups form the Blue Wedges group to oppose the proposed channel deepening and dredging, with organized protests carried out, culminating in the group taking action in the federal court in January 2008 against the Commonwealth to stop it signing off on the project. On the 15th of January 2008 it was announced that their appeal was dismissed, with dredging starting soon after. The government announced the completion of works in November 2009, ahead of schedule and $200 million under budget. Shipping channel's South Channel extends from the area of the Rip in an easterly direction where it terminates off the coast of Arthur Seat. Vessels with a draft of 14.0 meters can be navigated through the channel at all tides. This is the main commercial shipping channel in the south of the bay, allowing large ships access between the entrance of the bay and its middle regions. West Channel extends from the area of the Rip, heads towards the northwest and ends off the coast of St. Leonard's. The depth varies. In May 1998 there was a minimum of 4.1 meters. Non-commercial vessels are still navigated through the channel, however it is no longer used for commercial shipping. The Rip, also referred to as the Heads for shipping purposes. Vessels with a draft of 14.0 meters can be navigated through the heads during any height of tide. However, the passage of vessels can be restricted when the current through the Rip is too strong. The flow through the Rip can be up to 8 knots dependent on the range of tide and environmental conditions. Melbourne Channels extends northwards through Hobson's Bay towards Station Pier and the entrance to the Yarra River. It is dredged to a depth of 15.5 meters and is the main shipping channel through the north of the bay into Melbourne's ports and docks. The channels include Melbourne Channel, Williamstown Channel, Port Melbourne Channel. Geelong Channels begins off the coast of Point Richards and runs in a westerly direction through Outer Harbour and into Corio Bay, where it splits in two, heading north towards the modern port of Geelong and south towards Cunningham Pier. The main Geelong channels are dredged to 12.3 meters. The City Channel, while once used for wool exports, is no longer used for commercial shipping. The channels include Point Richards Shipping Channel, Wilson Spit Shipping Channel, Hopetoun Shipping Channel, City Channel, Corio Channel Shipping and Cargo Docks, Bulk Grain Pier, Corio Quay, Cunningham Pier, Gellibrand Pier, Lascelles Wharf, Point Henry Pier, Point Wilson Pier, Princes Pier, Refinery Pier, Station Pier, Webb Dock. Ferries. Peninsula Sea Road Transport operates a vehicular ferry service across the mouth of the bay between Queenscliff and Sorrento using two roll-on, roll-off vessels. Ferries also run from St Kilda to Williamstown, Victoria across Hobson's Bay. These ferries, like the many recreational cruises, mostly operate for tourists and run around the bay in various locations. Spirit of Tasmania Ferry, between Station Pier, Port Melbourne, and Devonport. Tasmania Sea Road Ferries, between Sorrento Pier, Sorrento, and the Cut Pier, Queenscliff. Other features. Flagship Enterprise is Melbourne's flagship, a replica of the Enterprise, the tall ship that brought the first European settlers to Melbourne. She sails around Port Phillip Bay throughout the year, visiting ports at Geelong, Williamstown, Portarlington, Ryan Blair Gowrie. Lighthouses, major marinas and piers, life-saving clubs, yacht clubs, shipwrecks. Some of the more significant and historical shipwrecks in the bay include Mountain Maid, sunk off Swan Island after a collision with the SS Queen. Warhope, sunk off the coast of Sorrento. Ozone, scuttled off Indented Head. HMVS Cerberus, scuttled in Half Moon Bay at Black Rock. HMAS J3 scuttled in Swan Bay. HMAS J7 scuttled off Hampton Beach. Eliza Ramsden. Marine sanctuaries. Point Cook Marine Sanctuary features basalt reefs that support many diverse communities of algae, invertebrates and fish species. Jawbone Marine Sanctuary supports several habitats including rocky basalt reef, seagrass beds, salt marsh and the largest occurrence of mangroves in Port Phillip. Ricketts Point Marine Sanctuary has sandstone rock platforms extending from the shore, creating a diverse marine environment. Tourism. The bay is one of Victoria's most popular tourist destinations. Many residents of Melbourne holiday on the shorelines of the bay, particularly the Bellarine and Mornington peninsulas, most annually, either camping in tents, caravan or villas in caravan parks, sharing rental houses or staying in holiday homes.